What if everything you thought you knew about the rise of ancient civilizations was only half the story? Picture this: beneath the dust of forgotten landscapes, hidden beneath layers of time, lie the ghosts of mighty rivers that once nourished the greatest societies the world has ever known. These lost waterways didn't just vanish, they took with them the true origins of cultures we thought we understood. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most overlooked mysteries: how the disappearance of these colossal river systems rewrote the birth narratives of 5 major civilizations, leaving behind clues that force us to rethink everything. Think about the last time you stood by a river, the way its currents shape the land, the way its presence breathes life into everything around it. Now imagine that river vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only whispers in the soil. That's exactly what happened to the lifeblood of ancient Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and other legendary cradles of civilization. These weren't just rivers, they were the architects of destiny, the silent partners of kings and farmers alike. When they disappeared, they didn't just leave behind dry riverbeds, they left behind gaps in history, puzzles that archaeologists are only now beginning to solve. This journey isn't just about maps and ruins, it's about rediscovering the pulse of forgotten worlds. What if the fall of these civilizations wasn't just about war or climate change, but about something as simple and devastating as a river changing course? What if the stories we've been telling ourselves for centuries missed the most important character of all, the water that made it all possible? Over the next few minutes, we'll trace the paths of these lost rivers, follow their echoes through time, and uncover how their absence forced societies to adapt, collapse, or vanish entirely. The answers might just change how you see the past and the fragile relationship between humanity and the forces of nature that shape our fate. So let's step into the shadows of history where the truth is waiting, buried beneath the sands of time. To understand just how deeply rivers shaped ancient civilizations, we need to step into the rhythm of life along their banks. Take the Nile, for example. Its annual floods weren't just a natural phenomenon, they were the heartbeat of Egyptian society. When the waters rose, they deposited rich black silt across the fields, turning the desert into a breadbasket. But more than that, the Nile's predictability shaped their entire calendar, their religion, even their concept of order. Pharaohs ruled as living gods because they were seen as the guarantors of the floods. Without that river's steady pulse, there would have been no pyramids, no hieroglyphs, no empire that lasted 3,000 years. Now contrast that with the Indus Valley, where the rivers behaved differently. The Gagger-Hacra river system, once thought to be mythical, now appears to have been the backbone of Harappan cities like Mohenjo-Daro. Archaeologists found elaborate drainage systems, public baths, and uniform brick sizes across settlements, all pointing to a society masterfully adapted to their waterways. But when satellite images revealed the ghostly outline of a massive riverbed running parallel to the Indus, everything changed. Suddenly, the collapse of this civilization looked less like a failure and more like an adaptation, a gradual migration as their life-giving waters shifted course beneath them. What's fascinating is how these rivers didn't just feed bodies, they fed imaginations. The Ganges wasn't merely a water source to ancient Indians, it was a goddess, a purifier of souls. The Euphrates and Tigris weren't just Mesopotamian highways, they were the very waters the Babylonians believed the world had emerged from in their creation myths. When a society's entire worldview is built around a river's presence, its disappearance does more than cause drought. It unravels their understanding of the universe. That's why studying these lost river systems is like finding missing pages from history's book. The Saraswati River, mentioned thousands of times in the Rigveda, was long dismissed as mythological until geological surveys showed its dried-up basin matching the sacred texts exactly. Similarly, China's Yellow River didn't just change course, it completely altered the destiny of dynasties, with some historians arguing that its unpredictable floods accelerated the fall of the Shang. These waterways weren't just features on a map, they were silent co-authors of human history, their absence leaving gaps we're still trying to fill. The real mystery isn't why these civilizations eventually declined, it's how they thrived so brilliantly in the first place. Their greatest achievements weren't just in spite of their rivers, but because of them. The precision of Egyptian astronomy developed to predict floods. The standardized weights of the Indus Valley likely emerged from river trade networks. Even Rome's expansion was fueled by grain from the Nile. When we follow these lost rivers, we're not just tracking water, we're tracing the very flow of human innovation, watching how necessity didn't just breed invention, but entire ways of life. The Indus Valley civilization didn't just rise by chance. It was engineered by rivers most of us have never heard of. For decades, history books credited the mighty Indus River as the sole life giver to this ancient society, with its carefully planned cities and advanced drainage systems. But beneath that textbook version lies a startling truth. There was another river far mightier that modern maps erased completely. The Saraswati wasn't just another waterway, it was a titan, stretching nearly 500 miles across what's now the Thar Desert. Ancient Vedic texts praised it as the best of rivers, flowing from the mountains to the sea. Yet when British surveyors arrived in the 19th century, they found only cracked earth where that legendary current should have been. What changed everything was the view from space. Satellite photographs revealed something startling: a massive paleochannel, a ghostly imprint of a once powerful river cutting through the desert. Geological surveys matched this dried-up bed with descriptions from 3,000-year-old hymns. Even more telling, over 60% of Indus Valley settlements cluster along this invisible line, not the Indus itself. The Harappans didn't just lose a water source when the Saraswati vanished, they lost their economic spine. This was their Mississippi, their Rhine, their highway for trade and communication between far-flung cities. Without it, the carefully balanced system began to unravel. But here's what most people miss: the Saraswati didn't just dry up overnight. Climate reconstructions show a slower, more tragic transformation. Around 4,000 years ago, tectonic shifts began stealing its water, diverting tributaries toward the Ganges instead. The river that had sustained generations became a trickle, then a memory. Yet the Harappans didn't just give up. Evidence shows they adapted, digging deeper wells, shifting crops, even relocating settlements eastward. Their collapse wasn't sudden, but a masterclass in resilience against forces beyond their control. The most haunting clue lies in the ruins of Kalibangan, where archaeologists found plowed fields still preserved beneath the dust. The furrows run in two directions, proof they grew both winter and summer crops, fed by reliable river waters. Then, abruptly, the patterns change. Later layers show desperate attempts at irrigation, then nothing. It's as if we're watching the moment the Saraswati's last gift ran out. Yet, even in retreat, this river shaped history. Some scholars believe its survivors became the Vedic people, carrying memories of their lost paradise into new lands. The Saraswati may have vanished from the earth, but never from human imagination. What makes this discovery so revolutionary is how it changes our view of civilization itself. We used to think great societies rose in places with reliable water, but the Saraswati's story shows they often rose in spite of water's fickleness. The Harappans weren't just beneficiaries of geography, they were its students, reading the land with a skill we're only now beginning to appreciate. Their true legacy isn't just in bricks and beads, but in the way they turned a disappearing river into a cradle for one of humanity's first experiments in urban living. When we look at that dry riverbed today, we're not seeing failure, we're seeing the echoes of extraordinary adaptability. Mesopotamia's story has always been framed by two legendary rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. But what if those weren't the only waterways shaping this cradle of civilization? Cuneiform tablets and ancient maps tell of a hidden network of tributaries that once spiderwebbed across the region, feeding cities like and Eridu long before Babylon rose to power. These weren't just minor streams, they were life-giving arteries, and their disappearance holds the key to understanding why some of history's first great cities flourished, then vanished without a trace. Take the city of Lagash, for example. For centuries, archaeologists puzzled over why this powerful Sumerian state collapsed around 2200 BCE. The answer lay beneath their feet, literally. Soil cores revealed something startling. An entire river system had once branched from the Euphrates, watering Lagash's fields, then abruptly dried up. The city's meticulous records, written on clay tablets, even describe officials desperately redistributing grain as the canal turned to dust. This wasn't just drought, it was the landscape rewriting itself, leaving societies scrambling to adapt. Here's where it gets fascinating. These lost tributaries didn't just vanish due to climate shifts, human hands played a role too. Ancient engineers, in their attempts to control floods, unwittingly starved some branches while overfeeding others. A canal built to serve one city might doom another downstream. The Akkadian Empire's fall around 2100 BC coincides eerily with sediment records showing entire channels silting up, likely due to over-irrigation. Their greatest innovation, controlling water, may have been their undoing, but the rivers left clues in unexpected places. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the gods send a flood to wipe out humanity. Scholars long dismissed this as myth until geologists found evidence of massive Euphrates flooding around 2900 BCE, precisely when early Sumerian cities show signs of abandonment. Even more telling, the epic describes the floodwaters receding to reveal new rivers, suggesting survivors witnessed the landscape transforming before their eyes. What we called mythology might actually be ancestral memory, encoded in poetry. Modern technology is revealing just how much we've missed. Satellite imaging shows ghost channels radiating from the Tigris like faint scars, routes that once connected Nineveh to trade networks now buried under Iraqi farmland. One dried-up waterway, the Palakopas, appears on Ptolemy's ancient maps but vanished by medieval times, taking with it the port cities that depended on it. These weren't just geographical changes, they were economic catastrophes in slow motion. When a tributary shifted, entire industries like the copper trade from Oman could collapse overnight as shipping routes evaporated. The most profound lesson lies in how these civilizations responded. Unlike the Harappans, who adapted by relocating, Mesopotamian rulers doubled down on control. They built ever more elaborate canals, taxed water usage, even waged wars over river access. Their determination to dominate nature rather than work with it might explain why their collapses were often abrupt. The rivers didn't just provide water, they forced societies to make choices that determined their survival. In those choices, we see the first echoes of our own relationship with an unpredictable planet. What truly rewrites Mesopotamia's story is realizing these rivers didn't just feed crops, they fed ideas. The world's first writing emerged to track water distribution. Early mathematics developed to calculate irrigation needs. Even concepts like property rights and legal codes grew from disputes over canals. The lost tributaries were more than water sources. They were the invisible currents shaping human thought itself. When they vanished, they didn't just leave dry riverbeds, they left gaps in the very fabric of civilization, spaces we're only now beginning to fill. The pyramids of Giza stand today as silent sentinels in the desert, but when they were built, they weren't surrounded by endless sand, they stood at the water's edge. Recent discoveries reveal the Nile once ran so close to these monuments that workers could have floated stones directly to the construction sites. Satellite imaging and sediment cores tell a startling story. A long-lost branch of the Nile, nicknamed the Khufu Branch, once flowed right past the pyramid complex, its waters lapping at the desert's edge like a liquid highway. This wasn't just convenient, it was revolutionary. The pharaohs didn't just build near the Nile, they built because of it, using its currents to transport limestone blocks weighing as much as elephants. But rivers are restless things. By the time of King Tutankhamun, roughly 1,000 years after the pyramids rose, this branch had shrunk to a shadow of itself. The same waters that fueled Egypt's golden age were retreating, leaving behind a puzzle in the ruins of abandoned cities. Take the ancient capital of Memphis, founded where the Nile's branches fanned out like fingers. For centuries, it thrived as a bustling port until the river's shifting courses turned its harbors into sand traps. Archaeologists found the city's docks buried under 30 feet of desert, a silent testament to the Nile's slow betrayal. The real shock came when researchers matched historical records with geological data. The fall of Egypt's Old Kingdom around 2100 BC lines up perfectly with evidence of catastrophic drought. But it wasn't just less rain, the Nile itself was reorganizing, its branches silting up as sediment built up over centuries. The pharaoh's greatest strength, their ability to predict the annual flood with uncanny precision, became their downfall when the river stopped following the old rules. Famine stelae, stone inscriptions describing desperate times, tell of people eating their children, of temples abandoned as priests fled starving crowds. This wasn't just a bad harvest, it was the collapse of a system built on water's promises. Yet even in retreat, the Nile shaped destiny. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 331 BC, he didn't choose Memphis as his capital. He picked a new city, Alexandria, where the western Nile mouth met the sea. The river's slow westward shift had turned the Mediterranean coast into Egypt's new heartbeat. Centuries later, when Napoleon's scholars mapped the country, they found entire cities mentioned in ancient texts completely missing, swallowed by the shifting delta. The Nile didn't just move, it rewrote geography, deciding which cities lived and which became footnotes. What's most fascinating is how the Egyptians fought back. They didn't just accept the river's changes, they engineered against them. The Fayoum Oasis, a thriving agricultural zone south of Cairo, was actually an artificial lake created by diverting Nile water through canals. When the river grew stingy, they dug deeper, building the world's first documented water measurement device, the Nilometer, to track every precious inch. Their struggle wasn't just about survival, it was a dialogue with nature, a 1,000-year conversation etched in mudbrick and hieroglyphs. The lesson hidden in the Nile's sands isn't about a civilization defeated by nature, but one that danced with it. Every flood, every shift, forced new innovations: mathematics to redistribute land after floods, medicine to combat waterborne diseases, even the calendar itself, designed around the river's moods. When we look at the pyramids today, we're not just seeing tombs, we're seeing the echoes of a river that refused to stay still, and the people who refused to let it go. The Nile's greatest gift wasn't just water, it was the relentless challenge that turned farmers into architects of eternity. The jungles of Central America hide more than just ruins. They conceal an entire hydraulic civilization that defied nature's odds. While most ancient cultures built along mighty rivers, the Maya faced a paradox: a land with too much rain yet no permanent rivers on the surface. Their solution: an underground web of cenotes, sacred sinkholes tapping into hidden groundwater, and a labyrinth of canals so precise, modern engineers still marvel at them. This wasn't just survival, it was a high-stakes chess game with water, where every move meant life or death for millions. Recent LiDAR scans peeled back the jungle canopy like lifting a veil, revealing reservoirs the size of football fields and canals snaking between cities like arteries. Tikal, one of the greatest Maya metropolises, wasn't just surrounded by forest, it was engineered around massive man-made holding tanks called aguadas, some holding over 20 million gallons. Farmers didn't just pray for rain, they directed it through terraced fields and filtration systems rivaling modern infrastructure. The Maya didn't conquer their environment, they danced with it, turning seasonal downpours into a reliable lifeline. But their brilliance carried a fatal flaw. Tree ring studies show the Maya faced not one, but 4 devastating droughts between the years 750 and 1050 C periods when rainfall dropped by half. The very reservoirs that sustained them became death traps as stagnant water bred disease, while silt-clogged canals choked supply lines. Phalanx rulers boasted of water mountains in their inscriptions, yet abandoned their city when those systems failed. What archaeologists once called collapse now looks more like a staggered retreat, as communities migrated toward surviving cenotes or the coast, their knowledge of hydrology unraveling with each dry season. The cruelest twist lies in the soil. Sediment cores from Lake Chichancanab tell a story written in minerals. As the Maya expanded, their deforestation altered local weather patterns, potentially worsening the droughts they feared. Their greatest strength, transforming the landscape, may have accelerated their undoing. Yet even in crisis, their adaptability astounds. At Karakol, engineers rerouted entire waterways during droughts, while coastal cities like Chelum thrived longer by tapping into underground rivers. The Maya didn't vanish, they reinvented themselves, proving resilience isn't about permanence, but the wisdom to change course. What rewrites their story isn't just the scale of their hydrology, but its spiritual dimension. Cenotes weren't just wells, they were portals to the underworld, where jade and gold offerings still rest in silent depths. The rain god Chok wasn't just a deity, he was a daily preoccupation, his image carved into gutter spouts and irrigation controls. When the rains failed, it wasn't just a climate event, it was a divine withdrawal, shaking the pact between heaven and earth. Modern science now confirms what Maya scribes recorded. Their golden age ended during the worst megadrought in 2,000 years. But their legacy flows on in the milpa farming techniques still used today, and the quiet persistence of communities who never stopped listening to the whispers of water in the limestone below. The real revelation, the Maya's so-called collapse, wasn't an ending. It was a metamorphosis. As cities like Kapon faded, new networks emerged along coasts and surviving waterways, their knowledge carried in stories and stone. The rivers they relied on didn't just vanish, they retreated underground, just as Maya culture adapted to survive. In their struggle, we see a mirror for our own age, a warning about pushing systems too far, and a testament to human ingenuity when the waters run dry. Their greatest lesson isn't written in stelae or temples, but in the quiet truth that civilizations don't end, they evolve, often in ways we're too quick to mistake for failure. Angkor Wat's towering spires have long symbolized the Khmer Empire's grandeur, but the real masterpiece lay hidden beneath the jungle, an aquatic network so vast it turned monsoon rains into an empire's lifeblood. While tourists gaze at temple carvings today, few realize they're walking atop the bones of a water system that once rivaled modern cities. LiDAR technology has peeled back centuries of vegetation, revealing a grid of canals, moats, and reservoirs stretching over 300 square miles, an ancient metropolis engineered to harness every drop. At its heart, the West Barre Reservoir held over 50 billion gallons, a liquid monument to human ingenuity. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was a civilization's pact with the seasons, a delicate balance between abundance and ruin. The genius of Khmer hydraulics wasn't just in scale, but in precision. Engineers designed their capital as a mirror of the cosmos, with temple moats mimicking sacred oceans and canals aligning with celestial patterns. Water flowed through the city like blood through veins, filling neighborhood ponds for daily use, flushing waste through clever gradients, even powering rudimentary hydraulic systems for construction. The Tonle Sap Lake's seasonal floods, which reversed the flow of the Siem Reap River, became a natural clockwork the Khmer exploited with breathtaking sophistication. Their inscriptions boast of mountains of water under royal control, not poetry but literal truth, yet this system carried the seeds of its own undoing. Tree rings from ancient cypress trees tell a grim story. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, the region suffered decades of erratic monsoons. Reservoirs built for steady rains faced either disastrous overflows or cracked mudflats. Sediment cores show something even more telling. The canals began silting up as deforestation changed water runoff patterns. The Khmer had engineered for a climate that no longer existed. Their sacred waters, once a source of power, became traps for malaria-bearing mosquitoes and algal blooms. The very symbol of their god-king's authority, the ability to control water, slowly drained away. What's haunting is how closely their collapse mirrors modern dilemmas. Like Phoenix or Las Vegas today, Angkor thrived by defying ecological limits. Its elite built ever larger temples, demanding more labor and resources even as the environment faltered. Inscriptions mention workers, exhausted from digging new canals as old ones failed. The final blow may have come from an unexpected direction. Recent studies suggest their massive water projects disrupted natural groundwater recharge, causing land to sink even as droughts intensified. The Khmer didn't just misread nature, they accidentally turned their greatest ally against them. But here's what gets overlooked: the Khmer didn't vanish. They adapted. While Angkor's core emptied, communities shifted south toward the Mekong Delta's reliable waters, taking hydraulic knowledge with them. The empire's end wasn't an apocalypse, but a redistribution. Modern Cambodian rice farmers still use modified versions of ancient Khmer irrigation techniques, proving the real legacy wasn't stone temples, but the wisdom to dance with water's whims. The lesson whispered in Angkor's dry moats isn't about failure, it's about the price of overreach. The Khmer built a paradise by mastering water, then fell when they assumed that mastery was permanent. Their story echoes across time, reminding us that civilizations don't collapse because nature is cruel, but because they forget how fragile their bargains with it really are. When we stand before Angkor Wat's reflection pools today, we're not just seeing a monument, we're seeing a mirage, the ghost of a society that mistook engineering for control and learned too late that even gods must bow to the rain. Rivers don't just carve landscapes, they carve identities into the bedrock of civilizations. Consider the Ganges, where a single dip in its waters is believed to wash away lifetimes of sin. This isn't mere superstition. It's the culmination of 3,000 years of sacred texts, rituals, and daily life revolving around a river's flow. But what happens when that river disappears? The Saraswati's vanishing act left more than a dry riverbed. It left a spiritual crisis. Vedic hymns that once praised its limitless glory were forced to reinterpret its absence, transforming the river from a physical force into a metaphysical one, flowing now only in the realm of myth beneath the earth. The Nile tells an even more profound story of divine connection. Ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on the river, they worshipped it. Hapi, the god of the annual flood, wasn't some abstract deity. Farmers made offerings to him as routinely as checking their fields. Temple reliefs show pharaohs ceremonially cutting irrigation channels, their divine authority literally measured by the Nile's flood levels. When those floods failed, it wasn't just crops that suffered, the entire cosmology shook. The pyramid texts, some of humanity's oldest religious writings, describe the Nile as the circulatory system of creation itself, linking the land of the living to the afterlife. A shifting river didn't just mean bad harvests, it called into question humanity's pact with the gods. Yet it's in the Indus Valley where we see the most startling transformation. The Harappans left no temples or obvious religious symbols, but they left something subtler. Dozens of their famous seals show unicorn-like creatures standing before ritual platforms, with what archaeologists now believe are stylized river motifs. When the Saraswati dried up, these images gradually disappeared from artifacts, replaced by new symbols of fire and sun. A people who had defined themselves by water found new meaning in its absence, their spirituality evolving as fluidly as the landscape itself. The Maya took this relationship even deeper, quite literally. Their cenotes weren't just water sources, they were portals to Xibalba, the underworld. Sacred texts like the Popol Vuh describe heroic twins descending into these watery caverns to battle gods of death and disease. When droughts came, it wasn't just survival at stake. It was as if the veil between worlds had thickened, the gods withdrawing their favor. Modern excavations still find jade offerings in these sinkholes, gifts to deities who controlled the rains. A civilization that mastered hydraulic engineering still knelt before water's spiritual power. What makes these lost rivers so haunting is how their absence forced cultures to reinvent themselves. Along the vanished Saraswati, later Hindu texts reimagined it as an invisible river joining the Ganges and Yamuna in a mystical trinity. The Nile's retreat saw Egyptians develop elaborate new irrigation gods alongside their old flood deities. These weren't just practical adaptations, they were profound psychological shifts. As societies rewrote their myths to match their new realities, the rivers didn't just sustain bodies, they shaped worldviews, and when they left, they took pieces of collective identity with them. Today, we're left with echoes in language itself. The word ritual comes from the Sanskrit rta, meaning the cosmic order, a concept originally tied to river flows. Our very idea of timekeeping stems from the Nile's predictable floods. These waterways didn't just feed civilizations, they gave them the metaphors through which they understood existence. When a river disappears, it's not just water that's lost, it's an entire way of seeing the world, leaving cultures to either fade or find new currents to follow. The true measure of these societies' greatness lies not in how they flourished with rivers, but how they reinvented meaning when the waters ran dry. Climate shifts have always been the unseen hand reshaping human destiny, and nowhere is this more devastatingly clear than in the fate of lost rivers. Take the Saraswati, once a roaring giant fed by Himalayan glaciers. Its decline began when subtle changes in Earth's orbit altered monsoon patterns around 4,000 years ago. Ice cores from Greenland tell the tale, a slow but relentless drying across the tropics, turning fertile plains into dust bowls. But here's what's chilling, this wasn't some sudden catastrophe. It was a creeping crisis playing out over generations, so gradual that the Harappans might not have noticed until their wells turned salty and their crops withered mid-season. By the time they realized their river was dying, it was already too late. The Nile's story is eerily similar. Sediment cores from the delta reveal a hidden rhythm of wet and dry cycles stretching back millennia. When rainfall dwindled in the Ethiopian highlands, the source of the Nile's life-giving floods, entire branches of the river vanished like mirages. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom didn't just face a bad harvest, they watched their entire concept of cosmic order crumble. Temple inscriptions shift from celebrating abundant floods to desperate pleas. The land is in turmoil, the river is empty, and dust storms veil the sun. This wasn't just bad weather, it was the unraveling of a civilization's contract with nature. Yet the Mayas' collapse hits closest to home. Theirs wasn't just a river disappearing, but rain itself. Stalagmites from Belizean caves preserve a chemical record of rainfall, showing that the Mayas' golden age coincided with unusually wet centuries. When those rains faltered, their meticulously engineered reservoirs became tombs for algae and mosquitoes. The cruel twist, their own deforestation may have worsened the droughts. By clearing jungles for farmland, they likely reduced the very moisture recycling that once fed their clouds, an ancient echo of our own climate feedback loops. What makes these ancient crises so urgent today is their unpredictability. The Saraswati didn't dry up in a linear decline. It flickered, sometimes surging back for decades, luring communities into false hope. The Nile's failures came in waves, with occasional good years masking the long-term trend. Sound familiar? Our modern climate crisis mirrors these ancient patterns, where short-term fluctuations hide irreversible shifts. The Mayas' final drought lasted only 40 years, a blink in geological time, but long enough to topple cities. The takeaway isn't doom, but perspective. These civilizations didn't passively succumb, they fought back with astonishing ingenuity. The Khmer built floating cities when their canals ran dry. Egyptians shifted from wheat to drought-resistant barley. The Harappans abandoned their cities but carried their knowledge eastward. Their struggles remind us that resilience isn't about preventing change, but adapting to it, a lesson etched in the bones of lost rivers. As we face rising seas and shifting rainfall, these ancient voices whisper a warning. The greatest threat isn't climate change itself, but the illusion that our systems are immune to it. The rivers of the past didn't just vanish, they were outlasted by the societies that learned to listen. The ancient world's greatest engineering marvels weren't pyramids or temples. They were the invisible networks of canals and dams that bent rivers to human will. In Mesopotamia, the first levees didn't just control floods, they allowed farmers to grow surplus crops year after year, fueling the world's earliest cities. But this power came at a price. Cuneiform tablets from describe a creeping disaster. As irrigation water evaporated under the relentless sun, it left behind salt that slowly poisoned the soil. Within centuries, what had been the Fertile Crescent became pockmarked with abandoned fields, their yields dropping by nearly 2/3. The same hands that coaxed wheat from desert sands unknowingly salted their own grave. Halfway across the world, the Khmer Empire faced a different reckoning. Their Barre's massive reservoirs spanning miles were engineering wonders, storing monsoon rains to last through dry seasons. But sediment cores from Angkor reveal a tragic oversight. As workers cleared forests to expand farmland, erosion choked these artificial lakes with mud. The very system designed to ensure stability became its own worst enemy, requiring constant dredging until even an empire's resources couldn't keep up. Inscriptions boast of kings commanding the waters like gods, yet nature had the final say when silt turned their hydraulic masterpiece into a swamp. The most haunting lesson comes from the Nile, where pharaohs built entire cities atop the river's shifting promises. When engineers diverted water to the Fayum oasis, they created an agricultural paradise for a while. Radiocarbon dating shows the region flourished for centuries before abruptly emptying around 1200 BCE. The culprit, gradual changes in the Nile's flow that their canals couldn't adapt to. Like a gambler doubling down, later rulers kept expanding irrigation networks even as the river's habits changed, until the entire system became too fragile to survive a single bad flood season. Yet for all these cautionary tales, there are flashes of astonishing foresight. The Indus Valley civilization designed their cities with standardized drains and wells, but avoided massive river-altering projects, perhaps understanding the risks. In Peru, the Nazca built Puquio's spiral underground canals that tapped aquifers without depleting them, surviving droughts that toppled neighboring cultures. These societies grasped something modern engineers are relearning: the difference between controlling water and collaborating with it. What makes these ancient struggles so relevant isn't just their failures, but their successes. The Maya's reservoir systems sustained millions for centuries before climate shifts overwhelmed them. Mesopotamian astronomy developed precise flood prediction methods still admired today. Even the Khmer's mistakes taught invaluable lessons about watershed management that inform Cambodian rice farming now. The true lesson of history isn't that engineering is futile, but that the most enduring solutions work with nature's rhythms rather than against them. When we stand by the crumbling canals of these lost civilizations, we're not seeing monuments to human hubris, we're seeing the first draft of an ongoing conversation between creativity and consequence, one that our generation is writing the next chapter of. Satellite archaeology has turned the Earth into an open book, its pages written in wavelengths invisible to human eyes. Where explorers once hacked through jungles or dug for years hoping to strike ruins, modern scientists now scan entire landscapes from orbit, peeling back layers of time with radar and infrared. The breakthrough came when NASA, a shuttle radar topography mission in 2000, mapped Earth's surface in unprecedented detail and accidentally revealed the ghostly outline of the Saraswati River, its dry bed glowing like a neon sign under microwave pulses. What took archaeologists decades to suspect, satellites confirmed in seconds. An entire civilization had thrived along a waterway modern maps had erased. But the real revolution lies in how these tools see beyond surface features. Ground-penetrating radar can detect soil density changes caused by ancient river silt, exposing waterways buried under 30 feet of sand. In Egypt, researchers used this to track the Nile's long-lost Khufu branch, its course marked not by water, but by the faint electromagnetic shadow of sediments deposited 4,000 years ago. Even more astonishing, thermal imaging from the European Space Agency's Sentinel satellites detected subsurface moisture patterns in Cambodia, outlining Angkor's vast canal network beneath dense rainforest. These aren't just maps, they're time machines revealing landscapes as they existed when pharaohs ruled and Khmer engineers moved mountains of earth. The technology's power isn't just in finding lost rivers, it's in reconstructing their lives. By analyzing mineral traces in satellite data, scientists can tell when a river last flowed. The Gagger-Hacra basin, once thought to be the mythical Saraswati, shows sudden sediment changes around 1900 BCE, suggesting its waters didn't just dry up. They were stolen by tectonic shifts that diverted tributaries toward the Ganges. Similarly, multispectral imaging of Mesopotamia has exposed ancient irrigation canals now buried under Iraqi farmland, their patterns revealing how Akkadian engineers overextended their water systems until the land turned against them. What makes this approach revolutionary is its scale. Where a traditional dig might uncover a single neighborhood, satellites can map entire civilizations in weeks. The Maya's hidden reservoirs, the Nile's abandoned delta branches, even the underground puquios of Peru's Nazca, all came to light not through shovels, but through algorithms passing reflected light. Archaeologists now speak of a digital excavation, where discoveries happen on screens before anyone sets foot in the field. Yet the most profound impact might be philosophical. These tools force us to reconsider what lost really means. A river that vanished 3 millennia ago still leaves scars in the Earth's electromagnetic profile. A city swallowed by jungle continues to whisper its presence through subtle vegetation changes detectable from space. The past isn't gone, it's simply waiting for us to develop the right eyes to see it. As satellite archives grow, who knows what other forgotten waterways will emerge from the shadows, ready to rewrite history's oldest stories with fresh ink drawn from the stars. Beneath our feet lies a hidden archive, written not in ink but in layers of mud and silt. These sediment cores are nature's most meticulous historians, preserving every flood, drought, and human intervention with startling clarity. Take the Indus Valley, where soil samples from the Thar Desert tell a story that contradicts centuries of assumptions. The sediment here isn't just dry dust, it's laced with minerals found only in Himalayan glaciers, proving a mighty river once carried those fragments hundreds of miles before abandoning them to the desert winds. Each grain is a timestamp, marking when the Saraswati's current slowed to a trickle, then vanished entirely. Egypt's delta mud holds equally explosive secrets. When researchers drilled deep into the Nile's floodplains, they uncovered alternating layers of rich black silt and parched earth, a climatic flipbook showing feast and famine across millennia. One striking layer, dated to around 2200 BCE, shows a sudden drop in organic matter, coinciding exactly with hieroglyphs describing years when the river forgot its duty. Even more telling, traces of barley pollen abruptly disappear, replaced by drought-resistant emmer wheat, a silent testament to farmers adapting as their lifeline faltered. These aren't just soil layers, they're survival strategies frozen in time. The real breakthrough came when scientists realized sediment could reveal human choices, not just natural events. In Mesopotamia, thick layers of salt crystals preserved in irrigation canals show where ancient engineers pushed the land too far. The soil tells a tragicomic tale. Early layers show careful crop rotation, followed by desperate over-irrigation as yields dropped, ending with a white crust of salt that rendered the fields useless for centuries. It's as if the earth itself kept receipts, documenting every misstep in agriculture's oldest experiment. What makes these muddy archives so revolutionary is their objectivity. Unlike biased historical accounts or fragmentary artifacts, sediment doesn't spin narratives, it records them. In Cambodia, cores from Angkor's reservoirs preserved pollen from imported plants, proving the Khmer's global trade networks lasted decades longer than written records suggested. Along the Yellow River, alternating layers of coarse sand and fine silt reveal a pattern of catastrophic floods, each one coinciding with dynasty collapses in Chinese chronicles. The dirt doesn't care about royal propaganda, it simply notes when the waters rose and the kings fell. Perhaps the most haunting sediment story comes from a humble oxbow lake near Harappa. As scientists extracted cores, they found an abrupt change, a layer of flood debris topped by wind-blown sand, all dated to the same period the city's wells were deepened. The Saraswati didn't just dry up, it died violently in floods before vanishing, leaving survivors to dig desperately for groundwater. This single meter of mud rewrote the Harappan collapse from a slow decline to a dramatic reckoning with nature's whims. The lesson in these layers isn't just about the past, it's a warning for our future. As modern dams trap silt that once nourished deltas, as groundwater pumping causes land to sink, we're writing new chapters in these subterranean records. Future archaeologists won't need scrolls or monuments to understand our era. They'll read it in microplastics trapped in estuary mud and radioactive traces from nuclear tests. The Earth has always kept score, and the sediments never forget. What we're seeing now isn't just ancient history, it's the first draft of our own legacy, being written one grain at a time. Sometimes the most accurate history books weren't written on parchment, they were passed down as stories around campfires. The Rigveda's hymns praise the Saraswati as mightier than all other rivers, flowing from the mountains to the sea. For centuries, scholars assumed this was poetic exaggeration until satellite imagery revealed a dried-up riverbed matching the description exactly, complete with Himalayan mineral deposits in its ancient delta. What seemed like myth was actually a hydrological report preserved in verse for 3,000 years. Mesopotamia's flood myths tell a similar story. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes walls of water so violent, even the gods cowered in fear. Modern sediment cores from show a layer of sterile clay dating to 2900 BC, evidence of a catastrophic Euphrates flood right when Sumerian cities were abandoned. The same event echoes in the Bible's Noah story and the Babylonian Atrahasis epic, suggesting these weren't just tales. They were cultural memories of real disasters, retold until they took on divine proportions. What's fascinating is how these stories encode precise details. The Mahabharata mentions the Saraswati disappearing into the desert at a place called Vinashana, the vanishing. Geological surveys show this spot aligns perfectly with where the river's main channel splits into smaller, evaporating streams. Maya flood myths describe waters retreating underground, a metaphor for their cenotes that modern divers confirm connect vast subterranean rivers. Even Homer's Odyssey, with its whirlpools and shifting currents, might reflect Bronze Age sailors' encounters with the now vanished Palacopas River's treacherous estuary. The real breakthrough came when researchers started treating oral traditions as data rather than fiction. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines describing rivers that walked led archaeologists to ancient riverbeds buried under the outback. In the American Southwest, Hopi migration stories matched the path of the long-drained Colorado River tributaries. These weren't just legends, they were survival maps preserving knowledge of water sources across generations. Perhaps the most poignant example comes from the Khmer. Their foundation myth tells of a prince winning sovereignty by shooting an arrow across a vast inland sea, a story long dismissed as fantasy. But LiDAR scans now show Angkor was built atop the ruins of an even older city, its foundations submerged under what was once a massive lake. Their arrow flight wasn't just a hero's boast, it was a measurement, marking the distance between high ground when the waters rose. This changes how we see all ancient stories. The Greek legend of Hercules diverting rivers to clean stables might encode early hydraulic engineering. China's Great U controlling floods with dredging tools could memorialize the first Yellow River taming projects. When societies faced ecological trauma, they didn't just record facts, they wove them into narratives durable enough to outlast empires. The line between myth and history isn't just thin, it was never there at all. These stories were never meant to be taken literally, but neither were they mere fiction. They were memory, science, and warning all at once, written not in clay but in the one medium guaranteed to survive, the human imagination. A river's disappearance doesn't just turn fertile land to dust, it unravels the delicate web of human connections built upon its waters. Along the Indus trade routes, where merchants once exchanged Mesopotamian bronze for Harappan carnelian beads, silence fell when the Saraswati dried up. Archaeologists find half-finished workshops in Mohenjo-Daro, their carefully standardized weights abandoned mid-production, as if workers walked away mid-measurement. This wasn't just economic collapse, it was the snapping of threads that had connected cultures across thousands of miles. The Maya faced a different kind of unraveling. When their reservoirs turned toxic during prolonged droughts, it wasn't merely thirst that drove people from cities like Tikal. The entire political order crumbled. Stele inscriptions show kings who once boasted of binding the waters, suddenly pleading with neighboring cities for aid. What began as water shortage escalated into warfare as desperate rulers sacked rival centers for their cenotes. The famous ball courts, where games once resolved disputes peacefully, became monuments to a system that could no longer mediate conflict when survival itself was at stake. Mesopotamia's tragedy played out in cuneiform tablets recording increasingly frantic grain loans. At first, temple administrators show orderly distributions, measured rations for workers digging emergency canals. Then come the ominous entries. The canal master took his family and fled north. Finally, the bleakest tablets simply list names of villages with one repeated symbol, the cuneiform sign for abandoned. Like dominoes, each failed harvest toppled another city-state, until even mighty Akkad's walls stood empty behind silt-choked moats. Yet some civilizations turned crisis into reinvention. Along the Yellow River, the Shang dynasty's collapse around 1000 BC gave rise to the Zhou, who transformed catastrophe into ideology. Their mandate of heaven doctrine framed river disasters as divine judgment against unworthy rulers, a brilliant political maneuver that turned environmental vulnerability into dynastic legitimacy. Similarly, Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs used Nile failures to justify expansion into Canaan, securing alternative grain sources while portraying themselves as saviors. The most startling pattern emerges when we map these events globally. From the Andes to the Indus, the centuries between 2200 and 1900 BC saw synchronized collapses across continents, all coinciding with climate shifts recorded in ice cores and stalagmites. The Akkadian Empire fell as monsoon rains failed. The Old Kingdom pyramids stood empty while the Nile faltered. Even distant cultures like Peru's Carol and China's Liangzhu show abandoned cities around this time. This wasn't just bad luck, it was the first era of climate-driven globalization, where interconnected societies rose and fell on the same disappearing waters. What makes these ancient crises so illuminating is their duality. The same rivers that destroyed also created opportunities. When the Saraswati failed, its survivors carried advanced metallurgy eastward, sparking India's Iron Age. Maya refugees brought hydraulic knowledge to coastal cities, creating new trade networks. Even Mesopotamia's chaos birthed history's first written legal codes. Hammurabi's laws emerged from the need to mediate water disputes in a drying landscape. A river's death wasn't an ending, but a brutal kind of evolution, forcing societies to innovate or perish. The ultimate lesson lies in what these civilizations couldn't foresee, their own role in their demise. Maya deforestation worsened droughts, Mesopotamian irrigation salted their fields, Khmer reservoirs bred malaria. Their greatest strength transforming landscapes became their fatal flaw when the climate shifted. Today, as we face our own environmental reckoning, these lost rivers whisper a warning. Civilizations don't fail because they lack technology or resilience, but because they mistake temporary solutions for permanent ones. The difference between collapse and survival may come down to recognizing when the old rules no longer apply and having the courage to rewrite them before it's too late. The idea of resurrecting lost rivers sounds like something from a science fiction novel, but in India's arid northwest, engineers are doing exactly that. The Saraswati Revival project isn't just about nostalgia for a mythical waterway. It's a radical attempt to reawaken underground reserves that once fed the ancient river's vanished current. Using satellite data to trace its buried channels, crews have drilled hundreds of wells into the Gagger-Hacra basin, tapping into aquifers that haven't seen daylight for millennia. The results are staggering. Villages that relied on water tankers now have year-round springs, and farmlands written off as barren are blooming again. But here's the catch: this isn't the Saraswati of legend. It's a patchwork of modern hydrology and ancient memory, proving that even when a river dies, its legacy lingers in the rocks below. Egypt is attempting something even more audacious along the Nile. As climate change threatens to diminish the river's flow by up to 70% this century, engineers are resurrecting pharaonic-era canals buried under desert sands. The logic is chillingly simple. If the Old Kingdom could store floodwaters in the Fayum oasis to outlast droughts, why can't we? But there's a twist: modern concrete linings now prevent the Nile's natural silt from replenishing the soil, meaning today's farmers must rely on chemical fertilizers their ancestors never needed. The river may flow again where it once did, but the relationship between water and land has fundamentally changed. The challenges reveal uncomfortable truths about playing nature's architect. In Mesopotamia, attempts to revive the Euphrates' ancient branches have backfired spectacularly. Reflooding salt-poisoned fields only spread contamination further. Meanwhile, China's South-North Water Transfer Project, which diverts Yangtze River water to replenish the dried-up Yellow River basin, has displaced hundreds of thousands while failing to restore historical flow levels. These aren't just engineering problems, they're philosophical ones. Can we rebuild ecosystems without repeating the mistakes that doomed them in the first place? Yet glimmers of hope emerge where traditional knowledge guides modern tools. In Peru, archaeologists and farmers have revived the Nazca's Puquillos, spiral groundwater channels, by combining drone surveys with ancestral stone-laying techniques. The result: desert valleys last farmed 1,000 years ago are producing crops again. Similarly, Arizona's Gila River Indian community has merged laser-mapped ancestral irrigation routes with solar-powered pumps, bringing back agricultural traditions their grandparents thought were lost forever. These projects work because they're not trying to turn back time, they're creating new relationships with old landscapes. The most profound lesson lies in what these efforts can't restore. You can pump water through a dry riverbed, but you can't resurrect the cultural tapestry that once thrived along its banks. The Saraswati may flow again, but the Harappan cities it sustained are gone forever. The Nile's restored canals won't bring back the flood festivals where pharaohs offered sacrifices to Hapi. Rivers aren't just water. They're living systems that shaped languages, rituals, and daily rhythms in ways no pipeline can replicate. Perhaps the real question isn't whether we can bring back lost rivers, but whether we're willing to learn from their ghosts. These waterways didn't just vanish. They were outmaneuvered by climate shifts and human overreach, the same forces we face today. Their revival demands more than engineering. It requires humility to recognize that water, like time, flows in one direction. The past isn't a blueprint, it's a mirror, showing us what endures when we work with nature rather than against it. As the shovel hits the earth on these ambitious projects, we're not just digging for water, we're unearthing a dialogue between what was, what is, and what might still be. Ancient civilizations didn't just struggle with water, they wrote the first draft of a crisis we're still grappling with today. Take California's Central Valley, where decades of over-pumping groundwater have caused the land to sink nearly 30 feet in some areas. It's a modern echo of Mesopotamia's salinity crisis, where irrigation canals slowly poisoned fertile fields with salt. The difference: We have satellite imagery showing us the damage in real time, yet we're repeating the same mistakes with eerie precision. But the parallels run deeper than environmental consequences. Just as Harappan engineers failed to anticipate the Saraswati's tectonic betrayal, modern cities like Cape Town and Chen have faced day zero water shortages despite advanced forecasting. The common thread isn't lack of technology, it's the dangerous assumption that past patterns will hold. The Mayas' reservoirs worked flawlessly for centuries until the climate stopped cooperating. Today, snowpack-dependent regions from the Himalayas to the Rockies are discovering the same harsh truth. Infrastructure built for yesterday's climate won't save us tomorrow. Yet buried in these ancient failures are unexpected blueprints for resilience. In Peru's Andes, farmers are reviving pre-Incan waru-waru, a system of raised beds and canals that alternately capture floodwater and retain moisture during droughts. It's not high-tech, but it works. Yields have jumped 50% in some areas. Similarly, Rajasthan's traditional johads, small earthen dams, have brought water back to over 1,000 villages by mimicking natural watershed patterns the Harappans might have recognized. These aren't nostalgic throwbacks, they're time-tested adaptations to the very uncertainties we're now facing. The most urgent lesson lies in governance. Cuneiform tablets from detail meticulous water allotments enforced by temple priests, while Angkor's inscriptions boast of officials who measured the waters without error. Compare that to today's transboundary conflicts like the Nile River disputes, where 11 countries vie for shares of a dwindling resource. Ancient systems weren't perfect. The Akkadian Empire's collapse proves that, but they recognized water as a public trust rather than a commodity. Modern solutions like Israel's drip irrigation show we can innovate, but only if we pair technology with the kind of collective responsibility that once kept city-states alive. What's truly humbling is how these civilizations anticipated problems we're only now acknowledging. The Khmer's barrays weren't just reservoirs, they were artificial wetlands that filtered water naturally, a concept now championed as green infrastructure. The Nazca's Puquio's tapped fossil aquifers without depleting them, something Arizona's groundwater laws still struggle to achieve. Even the myths hold wisdom. Vedic hymns describing the Saraswati's disappearance warn against over-reliance on any single source, a lesson Cape Town learned the hard way during its near-total water collapse in 2018. The crossroads we face now is whether to view these ancient systems as curiosities or catalysts. Dutch engineers are already designing room for the river projects inspired by the Mayas' adaptive floodplains. China's sponge cities echo Khmer techniques for absorbing monsoon rains, but the real breakthrough will come when we stop seeing water management as an engineering challenge and start treating it as a dialogue with the environment, one that requires listening to voices from across millennia. The solutions aren't just in pipelines or desalination plants, but in the accumulated wisdom of societies who learned, through bitter experience, that water shapes civilizations long after the rivers run dry. Rivers didn't just give rise to cities, they became the first victims of urban ambition. Take Mesopotamia, where the world's earliest skyscrapers, the ziggurats, cast shadows over fields turning white with salt. Every irrigation canal dug to feed growing populations carried a hidden curse. As water evaporated under the relentless sun, it left behind mineral residues that slowly strangled the soil. Cuneiform tablets from Lagash record the grim progression, first boasting of record barley harvests, then pleading with gods as yields plummeted by 60%, and finally admitting defeat as scribes wrote of fields abandoned to the bitter earth. The very engineering that made cities possible ultimately made them unsustainable, a lesson etched in the cracked clay of abandoned farmsteads. The Indus Valley tells a quieter but equally devastating story. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro reveal a city obsessed with water management, elaborate drains, public baths, and reservoirs, yet blind to its own consumption. Well shafts drilled deeper and deeper into the aquifer show a society chasing receding groundwater like a gambler doubling down. By the time the Saraswati's tributaries shifted, the Harappans had already overtaxed their backup systems. Their meticulously planned cities with standardized bricks and grid layouts became monuments to a fatal assumption that water would always flow on demand. The ruins whisper a warning: we're still learning. Sustainability isn't just about managing resources, but recognizing their limits. Nowhere is the paradox more striking than with the Maya. Their reservoirs were marvels of hydraulic engineering, capable of sustaining millions through seasonal droughts. But LiDAR scans reveal the tragic cost. Every new city meant another swath of rainforest cleared for plaster production. The very trees that recycled moisture into rain clouds were sacrificed to build temples honoring rain gods. Soil analysis shows the cruel twist. As deforestation expanded, local rainfall patterns shifted, turning engineered reservoirs into stagnant traps for algae and disease. The Maya didn't just misunderstand their environment, they engineered themselves into a corner where every solution created new vulnerabilities. What makes these ancient crises so relevant is their slow-motion inevitability. Unlike earthquakes or volcanoes, river decline rarely announces itself with drama. A canal silts up over decades, wells turn brackish grain by grain. The Maya had generations to notice their reservoirs shrinking, yet power structures built on growth kept pushing forward. Modern satellite images of California's Central Valley, where farmland sinks as aquifers empty, show the same pattern playing out in real time. The difference is we have the benefit of hindsight if we choose to see it. Yet buried in these failures are glimmers of hope. Some Harappan settlements show evidence of crop rotation and wastewater recycling, techniques now championed as circular economies. Mesopotamian farmers eventually switched to salt-tolerant date palms, adapting rather than fighting nature. Even the Maya's descendants preserved water law in oral traditions that still guide farming in the Yucatan today. These societies weren't ignorant, they were human, wrestling with the same trade-offs between immediate needs and long-term survival that we face now. The true lesson of these lost cities isn't that urbanization doomed them, but that they forgot who brought them to the dance. Rivers tolerated dams and diversions until they didn't. Forests absorbed punishment until they couldn't. The ruins stand not as condemnations of progress, but as invitations to relearn what these civilizations knew in their best moments, that cities thrive when they see themselves as part of a watershed, not its master. As we pump concrete into floodplains and drain ancient aquifers, their ghosts murmur a question: will we be the first civilization to truly listen? Rivers didn't just flow through the landscapes of ancient civilizations, they flowed through their very souls. To stand by the Ganges wasn't merely to witness a body of water. It was to stand in the presence of a goddess, her currents believed to wash away lifetimes of sin. In Egypt, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was Hapi, the god who brought life with each annual flood, his belly swollen with the promise of another harvest. These weren't poetic metaphors, they were the bedrock of daily existence. Temples rose where the water met the land, not as distant monuments, but as living intersections between the divine and the mundane. Priests didn't just offer prayers, they measured flood levels, interpreting the gods' moods in the rise and fall of the waters. The rituals surrounding these sacred rivers reveal how deeply survival was woven into spirituality. In Vedic traditions, the Saraswati's disappearance didn't erase her from hymns, it transformed her into a hidden, mystical force, flowing underground to join the Ganges and Yamuna in a trinity of purity. The Mesopotamians took it further. Their New Year's festival, Akitu, included a symbolic battle where the king's legitimacy hinged on the god Marduk's victory over the chaos of drought. Failed to celebrate correctly, and the rivers might withhold their bounty. This wasn't superstition, it was a cosmic contract where humanity's reverence directly influenced nature's generosity. Yet when rivers vanished, the spiritual reckoning was often more devastating than the physical loss. The Maya's cenotes, gateways to the underworld, turned from sacred springs into pits of despair during droughts. Offerings of jade and gold, once gifts of gratitude, became desperate bribes to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. In Egypt, when the Nile's floods failed, the pharaoh believed to be the god's representative on earth faced revolts. His divine mandate crumbled alongside the wheat fields. Faith didn't just comfort these societies, it was the framework through which they understood catastrophe. A dried-up river wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a divine verdict. The most fascinating adaptations emerged in the aftermath. Along the Gagger-Hacra's dried bed, later Hindu texts reimagined the Saraswati as an invisible river, her spiritual presence undiminished by her physical absence. The Mesopotamians, after witnessing the Euphrates' unpredictable wrath, created the first flood insurance temple storerooms stockpiled grain not just for practicality, but as acts of piety. Even the Khmer, whose barrays mirrored the celestial oceans of Hindu cosmology, shifted their worship toward the Mekong when Angkor's reservoirs failed, proving that faith could migrate even when water couldn't. What these ancient beliefs teach us is that river worship was never just about water. It was about acknowledging humanity's smallness in the face of nature's power. The gods of these rivers weren't kind, they were capricious, demanding, and sometimes cruel. Yet that very unpredictability forged a humility modern societies often lack. Today, as we pump aquifers dry and reroute rivers with concrete, we've stripped away the sacred from the scientific. The ancients knew what we've forgotten, that a river isn't just a resource. It's a force that giveth and taketh away, and whether we call it a god or a watershed, our survival still depends on respecting its will. Trade routes didn't just follow rivers, they were born from them. Picture a Harappan merchant in 2500 BC, loading copper ingots onto a wooden boat bound for Mesopotamia. The river beneath him wasn't just water, it was a liquid highway, its currents carrying not only cargo but the very blueprint of early globalization. Archaeologists find Indus Valley seals in ancient Ur, Mesopotamian beads in Mohenjo-Daro, and evidence of timber from the Himalayas reaching Oman's shores. These connections didn't happen by chance. They were made possible by rivers like the Saraswati, whose vanished channels once linked the subcontinent to the Arabian Sea. When that river retreated, it didn't just strand boats, it severed a lifeline that had fueled trade for centuries. The Nile operated on an even grander scale. Egyptian hieroglyphs boast of the river that unites the two lands, but its reach stretched far beyond. Papyrus records detail expeditions sailing upstream into Nubia for gold, ebony, and ivory, while downstream, delta ports buzzed with ships from Crete and Canaan. The Nile's predictability, its annual floods rising and falling like clockwork, allowed pharaohs to plan grain shipments with military precision. Yet when drought choked its waters around 2200 BC, the ripple effects were catastrophic. Wall paintings in Syrian cities suddenly stopped showing Egyptian pottery, and tomb inscriptions in Thebes lament the loss of the northern trade. A river's retreat didn't just mean economic loss, it meant the slow unraveling of a network that had shaped the Bronze Age world. Along the Mekong, the story took a different turn. Khmer merchants didn't just transport goods, they transported ideas. Hindu statues from India floated upriver to Cambodia, while Angkor's architectural styles drifted south to Java. The river's seasonal floods created a unique rhythm during high water. Boats could travel hundreds of miles inland. In the dry season, markets clustered around dwindling pools. This ebb and flow made the Mekong more than a trade route. It was a cultural conveyor belt. When Angkor's hydraulic system failed, that belt ground to a halt. Chinese ceramics, once commonplace in Khmer cities, vanish from archaeological layers. Temple inscriptions shift from boasting of foreign luxuries to pleading for local rice. The water's retreat didn't just starve bodies, it starved imaginations, cutting off the flow of art, religion, and innovation that had fueled Southeast Asia's golden age. What's often overlooked is how these river highways shaped more than just commerce, they shaped time itself. Mesopotamian calendars were set by flood seasons crucial for shipping. The Indus Valley's standardized weights likely emerged to simplify tolls along waterways. Even language flowed with the currents. The word money traces back to the Latin moneta, named after Juno's temple where Rome minted coins, but its deeper roots may lie in the Sanskrit mana, meaning measure, a term born from river trade. When a river changed course, it didn't just disrupt trade, it scrambled the very systems societies used to organize their world. The most haunting evidence lies in the artifacts that never arrived. Excavations at Harappan ports reveal empty warehouses where Mesopotamian dates and Lebanese cedar should have been. Egyptian tombs from drought periods show paintings of offering tables with foreign wines conspicuously absent. These silent gaps tell us more than any ledger ever could. They're the archaeological equivalent of a phone line going dead mid-conversation. The rivers that had been so generous in life left behind not just dry beds, but cultural voids where once there had been a constant hum of exchange. Yet even in their absence, these waterways left indelible marks. The spices that once traveled the Saraswati's length became so coveted, they inspired later overland routes like the Silk Road. Nile shipbuilding techniques resurfaced centuries later in Mediterranean galleys. The Khmer's monsoon-driven trade cycles evolved into the Indian Ocean's seasonal dhow voyages. Rivers may have dictated history's flow, but human ingenuity ensured their lessons, like their waters, seeped into the bedrock of civilization, waiting to resurface when the world was ready to listen. War wasn't just fought over land or gold. Some of history's bloodiest conflicts erupted over the right to control a river's flow. Along the Nile, pharaohs didn't just build pyramids, they waged campaigns to secure the river's tributaries, understanding that whoever controlled the water controlled Egypt's fate. Inscriptions at Karnak boast of Thutmose III conquests upriver, not for glory but to dominate the sources of the annual flood. The Battle of Megiddo, often called history's first recorded conflict, wasn't just about territory, it was about securing trade routes to freshwater springs that fed the Nile's eastern branches. Lose those and the breadbasket of Thebes would wither. Mesopotamia's clay tablets tell an even darker story of water wars. The city-states of Lagash and Umma fought for generations over a single canal, their disputes recorded in chilling detail. One tablet from 2500 BC describes how Lama of Umma set fire to the boundary stones and diverted the life-giving water, leaving Lagash's fields to parch. The response was brutal. King Inatum of Lagash commemorated his victory with the steel of the vultures, showing vultures picking at the bones of Umma's soldiers. These weren't just skirmishes, they were existential struggles where water meant survival itself. The Khmer Empire's reservoirs became strategic targets in ways we're only beginning to understand. Inscriptions at Angkor describe enemies poisoning the waters during sieges, likely by contaminating barrays with disease-ridden corpses. But the most devastating attacks weren't always violent, they were hydrological. Recent LiDAR scans show how Cham invaders from Vietnam systematically breached dikes during their 12th century invasion, turning Angkor's intricate water network from asset to liability overnight. The genius that had sustained the empire now flooded its own cities, proving that in warfare, a civilization's greatest strength could become its fatal weakness. What makes these ancient conflicts so unnerving is how familiar they feel today. The same stretches of the Nile that once saw pharaonic armies clash are now flashpoints in Ethiopia's Renaissance dam dispute, where control over water flow threatens to ignite modern warfare. Syria's civil war saw ISIS weaponize water just as Ummah did millennia before, seizing dams on the Euphrates to flood or starve downstream communities. From the Aral Sea to the Colorado River basin, the pattern repeats: scarcity breeds desperation, and desperation breeds violence, yet buried in these stories are glimpses of another path. The Indus Valley shows remarkably little evidence of water wars despite its decline, suggesting sophisticated sharing agreements. Along the Tigris, rare treaties like the one between the Hittites and Mitanni included clauses guaranteeing water access even during hostilities. These exceptions prove that conflict wasn't inevitable, it was a choice, one that some societies rejected even in the face of collapse. The ultimate lesson from these ancient battles isn't just about water's power to start wars, but its potential to forge peace. When Ramses II finally ended Egypt's conflict with the Hittites, the treaty carved into temple walls included provisions for mutual aid during droughts. The enemies who had fought over the Nile's bounty recognized something profound: that rivers pay no loyalty to kings or empires, and that survival sometimes means sharing what nature provides unevenly. As modern nations face shrinking aquifers and shifting monsoons, these ancient voices whisper across time. The choice between water wars and water wisdom is, and always has been, ours to make. Poets and painters have always been the keepers of forgotten waters, turning lost rivers into eternal verses and pigments. When the Saraswati retreated into the desert, it didn't vanish from human consciousness. It flowed instead through the Rigveda's hymns, described as swifter than thought, mightier than the dawn. These weren't just metaphors, they were precise observations disguised as devotion, preserving the river's grandeur long after its bed turned to dust. A 4,000-year-old seal from the Indus Valley shows a unicorn standing before what archaeologists now recognize as a stylized river, perhaps the Saraswati herself, frozen in time on a piece of carved soapstone. Egyptian tomb paintings tell a similar story in vibrant pigments. Scenes of the Nile's bounty weren't merely decorative, they were spiritual insurance, ensuring the river's generosity would continue in the afterlife. A fresco in Thebes shows Hapi, the flood god, pouring water from twin jars, a coded message about the Nile's dual sources in the Ethiopian highlands and Lake Victoria, knowledge that would have been vital for survival. Even the pyramids' alignment speaks to hydrological obsession. Their sides mirror the Nile's cardinal directions, turning stone into a permanent prayer for the river's faithfulness. Angkor's bas-reliefs take this fusion of art and hydrology to breathtaking heights. The Bayon Temple's walls don't just depict battles, they show everyday life along canals, with fishermen hauling nets and children splashing in reservoirs. One panel illustrates a royal procession crossing a bridge, its arches mirrored perfectly in the water below. This wasn't artistic license. Recent LiDAR scans confirm the bridge existed exactly as carved, down to the last detail. The Khmer didn't just record their waterways, they turned them into stone hymns, ensuring future generations would remember the engineering marvels that once fed an empire. Literature holds even more startling truths. A cuneiform tablet from Nineveh describes the Euphrates, roaring like a bull, during floods, a description modern hydrologists confirm matches sediment records from that era. The Maya's Dresden Codex doesn't just track Venus, it includes tables predicting droughts, linking celestial cycles to the very rains their reservoirs depended on. These works blur the line between poetry and science, proving that ancient artists were the first historians, documenting ecological shifts long before the term existed. The most poignant tributes emerge from absence. Along the vanished Gagger-Hacra, folk songs still describe the river that flows beneath our feet, its memory kept alive through oral tradition. In China, scholars recently deciphered oracle bone inscriptions lamenting the Yellow River's unfilial behavior, a heartbreaking personification of a river that had nurtured then betrayed its people. Even Homer's Odyssey, with its whirlpools and treacherous straits, may encode Bronze Age sailors' terror of rivers like the Palacopas, whose unpredictable currents sank ships without warning. What makes these artistic echoes so vital is their unflinching honesty. Where official records might glorify kings, art preserves the human experience: the farmer watching his field salinize in Mesopotamia, the Harappan mother whispering Saraswati's name to her child, the Khmer engineer staring at a half-empty barre. Creativity became the ultimate act of defiance against time, ensuring that even as rivers vanished, their stories would never run dry. The brushstrokes on a tomb wall, the cadence of a hymn, the careful grooves of a seal, these are the true waters that still flow, connecting us to civilizations who understood that to remember a river is to keep it alive forever. Genetic traces whisper secrets. The ruins count how rivers didn't just carry water, but the very blueprint of human ancestry. When the Saraswati River shrank to a ghost in the desert, it didn't just leave abandoned cities, it sent waves of migration rippling across the subcontinent. DNA studies from Rajasthan to the Gangetic Plain show a startling pattern. Clusters of genetic markers that originated along the Indus Valley suddenly appearing further east around 4,000 years ago, precisely when sediment cores confirmed the river's decline. These weren't random wanderers, they were communities carrying metallurgy skills and urban planning knowledge, their genetic signature still detectable in populations from Delhi to Dhaka today. The river's death became a catalyst, scattering its people like seeds on the wind. The Nile tells a different but equally profound genetic story. While pharaohs built monuments to eternity, the river itself was quietly rewriting human connections. Recent studies of ancient Coptic DNA reveal how fluctuations in the Nile's flow created genetic bottlenecks, periods when only certain populations could survive along its shrinking banks. During droughts around 2200 BC, the river's southern reaches became nearly impassable, isolating Nubian gene pools from Egyptian ones for centuries. Then, when the floods returned, the genetic record shows sudden mixing, as if a dam had burst. This wasn't just seasonal change, it was a liquid pendulum swinging back and forth between connection and isolation, its rhythm etched in mitochondrial DNA passed down through generations. But the most surprising revelations come from Southeast Asia. The Mekong River, long considered a natural highway for human expansion, turns out to have been a genetic filter. Analysis of teeth enamel isotopes from ancient Khmer skeletons shows something unexpected. While goods traveled freely upriver, people largely didn't. The genetic divide between communities just 100 miles apart along the Mekong's twists is sharper than between some European nations, proving the river wasn't just a conduit, but a barrier shaping who mixed with whom. The same waters that carried trade goods could keep human populations separate for millennia, their DNA diverging like branches on a tree. What makes these genetic trails so revolutionary is how they contradict old assumptions. The Yellow River's cradle of Chinese civilization narrative gets complicated when DNA reveals northern and southern populations mixed far less than historians assumed, despite shared water sources. Along the Danube, isotopes in Bronze Age teeth show seasonal migration patterns following fish runs, a proof that rivers guided not just where people settled, but how they moved through the years like hands on a clock. Even the Amazon's sprawling network left genetic calling cards. Indigenous groups separated by thousands of miles show startling similarities in immune system genes, likely because the river's labyrinthine tributaries allowed just enough contact to share diseases and the defenses against them. The ultimate irony lies in what these DNA rivers can't erase. When researchers sampled modern Punjabis whose ancestors fled the Saraswati's decline, they found higher frequencies of a gene variant linked to salt tolerance, a biological echo of adapting to brackish well water. Along the Nile, Coptic Christians still carried genetic markers for malaria resistance that first appeared during periods of stagnant floods under Roman rule. Rivers shape us long after they've changed course, their influence flowing not just through our stories and cities, but through the very molecules that make us who we are. The water may retreat, but the mark it leaves is as permanent as a scar or a helix twisting through time. The next frontier in uncovering lost rivers isn't just about better satellites or sharper drones, it's about teaching machines to read the Earth's hidden language. Imagine artificial intelligence combing through terabytes of satellite imagery, detecting subtle patterns in vegetation or soil moisture that human eyes would miss. Already, researchers have trained algorithms to identify paleochannels, ghostly riverbeds, by analyzing the way certain plants grow along long-vanished water routes. In Australia's outback, this method recently revealed an ancient network of waterways beneath the desert, matching Aboriginal songlines that had been passed down orally for generations. The land remembers what we've forgotten, and now technology is learning to listen. Drones are adding another layer to this revolution, hovering just meters above the ground to capture laser scans with pinpoint accuracy. In the Yucatan Peninsula, where dense jungle hides the Maya's hydraulic secrets, LiDAR-equipped drones have exposed reservoirs and canals invisible from the air. But the real breakthrough lies in what comes next: swarms of autonomous drones mapping entire river systems in days, their data stitched together into 3D models that let us walk through landscapes as they existed millennia ago. Picture slipping on a virtual reality headset and standing on the banks of the Saraswati at its peak, watching merchants unload goods from boats that haven't sailed for 4,000 years. The most intimate revelations, though, may come from the chemistry of bones and teeth. Isotope analysis, a kind of dietary time machine, can now trace where ancient individuals sourced their water and food. In the Indus Valley, studies of tooth enamel have revealed seasonal migration patterns tied to long-lost tributaries, showing how communities adapted as the Saraswati fragmented. Upcoming techniques promise even finer resolution, like identifying specific algae from ancient water sources trapped in dental plaque. These aren't just scientific curiosities, they're breadcrumbs leading us back to the rivers that shaped entire ways of life. What makes this moment so extraordinary is the convergence of tools. Geneticists comparing modern populations to ancient DNA can track migrations triggered by river shifts. Climate models fed with pollen and sediment data can simulate how monsoons failed or shifted. Even crowdsourced archaeology is playing a role. Apps that let farmers report unusual soil changes have led to discoveries of buried channels in Mesopotamia. The puzzle pieces are scattered across disciplines, but for the first time, we're building a table big enough to fit them all together. The implications stretch far beyond academia. Indigenous communities are partnering with researchers to match oral histories with emerging data, reclaiming knowledge systems dismissed for centuries. In India, revived interest in the Saraswati has sparked water conservation projects along its ancient path. And as climate change alters modern rivers, understanding how past civilizations adapted or didn't could mean the difference between resilience and ruin. The most thrilling prospect, we've likely only found a fraction of what's out there. Somewhere beneath the Sahara's sands, the lost rivers that once fed green corridors await rediscovery. The Amazon's sprawling network, much of it still unmapped, could hold clues to civilizations entirely unknown. Even familiar landscapes like Europe's North Sea coast, drowned since the last ice age, may preserve river valleys where early humans thrived. The past isn't finished speaking, it's just been waiting for us to develop the tools to hear its whispers. And with every technological leap, we're not just uncovering history, we're recovering the blueprints of survival from those who navigated these waters before us. The ghost rivers of antiquity don't just whisper to us from the past, they're shouting urgent warnings about our present. Consider California's Central Valley, where decades of over-pumping groundwater have caused the land to sink nearly 30 feet in some areas, mirroring Mesopotamia's ancient salinity crisis with eerie precision. Or look to Cape Town's Day Zero water scare in 2018, when a modern metropolis came within weeks of turning off its taps, a scenario the Maya would have understood all too well as their reservoirs turned to sludge. These aren't isolated incidents, they're chapters in a repeating story where human ambition collides with nature's limits, and the stakes grow higher with each cycle. What makes these ancient water crises so instructive isn't their tragedy, but their predictability. The Harappans didn't wake up one day to find the Saraswati gone. They had generations of dwindling floods to adapt. Yet their meticulously planned cities still failed, trapped by the same cognitive bias we face today, the assumption that what has always flowed will always flow. Modern cities from Phoenix to Chennai are making identical bets, building skyscrapers atop aquifers that took millennia to fill but mere decades to drain. The difference: we have 4,000 years of hydrological post-mortems at our fingertips, if we choose to consult them. The Khmer Empire's barrays offer a particularly haunting parallel. These massive reservoirs worked flawlessly for centuries until deforestation changed rainfall patterns and silt choked their capacity. Fast forward to today's megadams, the Hoover Dam's Lake Mead, a critical water source for 25 million people, now sits at historic lows, its bathtub-ringed shores exposing the same arrogance of scale. Yet there's hope in the alternatives we're rediscovering. Rajasthan's farmers have revived Johad's ancient rainwater harvesting structures that mimic natural watersheds, bringing water back to over 1,000 villages. These aren't antiquated solutions, they're time-tested adaptations that work with ecological rhythms rather than against them. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in governance. Cuneiform tablets from detail water allocations enforced by temple priests, while Angkor's inscriptions boast of officials who measured the waters without error. Compare that to today's transboundary conflicts like the Nile River disputes, where 11 countries vie for shares of a dwindling resource. Ancient systems weren't perfect. The Akkadian Empire's collapse proves that, but they recognized water as a communal trust rather than a commodity. Israel's success with drip irrigation shows we can innovate technologically, but the Maya's downfall reminds us that no engineering can compensate for fractured stewardship. The climate crisis adds terrifying new urgency to these old patterns. As Greenland's ice melts, it's not just coastal cities at risk. The entire global conveyor belt of ocean currents could shift, potentially disrupting monsoon cycles that 2 billion people rely on. This isn't speculation. Sediment cores show similar disruptions occurred during the Maya's collapse, when a tiny temperature shift triggered decades of drought. Yet ancient peoples also demonstrate astonishing resilience. The Gagger-Mountains of the Sahara, facing a drying climate 2,000 years ago, tapped fossil aquifers with underground tunnels called fagaras, a system still used in Iran today. Their ingenuity whispers a counter-narrative to doom. Adaptation is possible, but only if we heed the past. What these lost rivers ultimately teach us is humility. The Nile's pharaohs styled themselves as gods controlling the floods until the river proved them mortal. The Khmer's barrays, designed to command monsoons, became breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that likely spread their empire's final epidemics. Our own era of megadomes and cloud seeding may seem different in scale, but not in kind. The sobering truth is that civilizations don't fail because they lack technology or intelligence. They fail when they mistake temporary solutions for permanent ones, when they prioritize control over coexistence. The rubble of Angkor and the dust of Mohenjo-Daro aren't just relics, they're mirrors. As desalination plants rise along the Mediterranean and engineers debate refreezing the Arctic, we're still wrestling with the same fundamental question these ancient peoples faced: how to thrive in a world where water is both our most vital ally and most unpredictable variable. Their stories offer no easy answers, but something more valuable: perspective. However advanced we become, we remain bound to the same elemental truths that shaped the first cities: that all life flows from water, and no civilization, no matter how mighty, can survive when its rivers run dry. The silent riverbeds of antiquity aren't just relics of the past, they're living classrooms. Every cracked mudflat where the Saraswati once roared, every silt-choked canal in Mesopotamia, tells the same cautionary tale: civilizations rise and fall by water's grace. Today, as reservoirs dry up from Arizona to Zimbabwe, we're not just observers of history, we're standing in the footprints of pharaohs and Harappans, facing the same existential test they failed. The difference: we hold something they didn't: 4,000 years of hindsight, etched in abandoned wells and sunken temples. Take California's Central Valley, where almond orchards now rise above land sinking from over-pumped aquifers. It's a modern echo of Mesopotamia's salinity crisis, complete with farmers watching their fields turn white with mineral residue. Or consider Cape Town's Day Zero scare, when a 21st century metropolis came within weeks of turning off its taps, a scenario the Maya would have recognized instantly as their reservoirs turned to sludge. These parallels aren't coincidental. They're the inevitable result of societies pushing ecological limits, whether with bronze tools or industrial pumps. Yet buried in these ancient tragedies are seeds of hope. The Gagger-Mountains of the Sahara didn't vanish when their lakes dried up. They engineered fagaras, underground tunnels tapping fossil aquifers that still function today. Rajasthan's farmers have revived Johad's medieval rainwater catchments, bringing water back to 1,000 villages. Even Los Angeles is experimenting with sponge streets that mimic the Khmer Empire's permeable landscapes, letting stormwater recharge aquifers instead of racing to the sea. The solutions aren't just in silicon chips and desalination plants, they are in the dirt beneath our feet, where forgotten wisdom waits to be rediscovered. What makes these lost rivers truly timeless is their lesson about humility. The Nile's pharaohs styled themselves as gods commanding the floods, until the river proved them mortal. Angkor's engineers boasted of binding the waters, only to see their reservoirs become mosquito-infested swamps. Our own era of cloud seeding and megadomes repeats the same fatal assumption, that technology can outwit nature indefinitely. The sobering truth whispered by these dry riverbeds is that civilizations don't fail from lack of innovation. They fail when they mistake temporary control for permanent victory. The most profound revelation lies in how these ancient societies adapted or didn't. When the Saraswati retreated, some Harappans dug deeper wells, others migrated eastward, carrying their culture to new lands. The Maya abandoned inland cities but thrived along coasts, trading stone pyramids for salt pans. Their choices created a living map of resilience, showing that survival isn't about stubborn permanence, but the wisdom to change course. As glaciers melt and aquifers drain, this flexibility may be their greatest legacy, not the grand monuments they left behind, but the quiet lessons in letting go. Standing at the edge of our own unfolding water crisis, we're not just archaeologists piecing together the past, we're actors in a story older than writing itself. The difference this time, we can read the last pages before we live them. The ghosts of lost rivers don't just warn of what's coming, they illuminate the paths through it if we're brave enough to follow. Their dry channels aren't graves, they're guidebooks written in mud and memory, waiting for us